So now I'd like to hand things over to Amelia to kick us off for today.
Great. Thanks so much, Shane. And thank you everyone for being here today. And thanks to the BigSurv Planning Committee. This has been a wonderful ride, BigSurv20 virtual style. So I just want to welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the closing plenary for BigSurv20. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Amelia Burke-Garcia, and I'm a program area director at NORC at the University of Chicago. I'm so honored to be here today moderating this panel on data and privacy with this panel of esteemed speakers. I would like to first introduce our panel of speakers briefly. Our first speaker is Jennifer Hunter-Childs. She is the Assistant Center Chief for Emerging Methods and Applications at the U.S. Census Bureau. She is joining us today to talk about differential privacy. Then we have Dr. Chipo Dendere. She is an assistant professor of African Studies at Wellesley College and also chair of Social Science One's Africa working group. And she is joining us today to talk about data use and privacy in the Global South. Then we have Dr. Radha Iyengar-Plum. She's the Director for Trust and Safety Research and Insights at Google. And she's joining us today to talk about research on data transparency. And finally, we've got Bianca Marceau, the Senior Advocacy and Standards Programs Coordinator at Isomar, a not-for-profit organization that promotes the value of market opinion and social research and data analytics. And she's going to be talking today about operationalizing ethics through data counseling. I want to review the structure for today's session. We're going to hear from each of the speakers in the order that I just introduced them. Each speaker will introduce themselves and then present for about 7 minutes on their topic. Once everyone is finished, I will ask each of the panelists a couple of questions, and then I'll end the session with a couple of questions for all panelists. Then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So stay with us today. There's a lot more to come. And just to get us started, I'm going to now turn the mic over to our first speaker, Ms. Jennifer Hunter-Childs.
Thank you, Amelia. Let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. I'm going to be talking about differential privacy, as Amelia mentioned. I am not a technical expert on differential privacy, but I've been engaged in a line of research on talking with respondents, talking with the public about the privacy accuracy trade-off that is implicit in differential privacy or inherent in differential privacy. So I'm speaking to you today from that lens, talking about differential privacy in a way that's understandable and comprehensible to the public. These are the technical experts at the Census Bureau. So if you have technical questions, I'm going to send you straight this way. I want to thank them for providing this content, in particular, Michael Hawes, for helping me work this out in a way that's easy to convey to the general public. So the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is critical for our ability to produce high-quality statistics about the nation's public and the economy. Protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data is both a legal requirement and is inherent in our culture at Census. The privacy challenge is that every time you publish a statistic calculated from a confidential data source, you reveal or leak a tiny bit of private information in the process. In 2003, in what later became known as the database reconstruction theorem, Dinur and Nissim demonstrated that if you release too many statistics, you will eventually reveal the entire underlying confidential data source. And as data gets bigger and computers get faster, the risks of this increase. So our current adoption of formal privacy for the 2020 census is merely the latest step in a long history of innovation and continuous improvement in our privacy protections, and a necessary one to counteract the 21st century privacy threats posed by the proliferation of external data and increasingly powerful algorithms that make re-identification of individuals ever easier. We'll be talking a little bit more about this, how this happens. Aggregate tabular data can often be thought of as like a giant game of Sudoku. With Sudoku, if you have enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, there's one and only one way to solve the puzzle. When you publish enough data tables, eventually is one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded the published table results. While it might have seemed unthinkable a decade ago, the computer algorithms can now perform these reconstructions of individual records from aggregate tabular data quite easily and quickly. While the reconstructed records would never have individuals' names on them, they would have pseudo-identifiers that could be used to link to an outside data source that does have names. In this example shown on the screen, the attacker can use age and sex to match the reconstructed records to a third-party data, like a voter registration list for that census block. And then it's easy to attach the name to the records, and then you just learned these people's race and relationship status, which you didn't have before. Remember that the database reconstruction theorem tells us that every release of a calculation or a tabulation derived from a confidential data source leaks a tiny amount of private information. The 2010 census collected attributes for 309 million people in the United States, and that totaled 1.9 billion confidential data points. And the 2010 census data products released over 150 billion aggregate statistics derived from those data. So researchers at the Census Bureau wanted to see if they could reconstruct census data given what was available in the public. And these researchers determined that using not even all of the public data products, a small portion of them, they were able to accurately reconstruct individual data for all inhabited blocks in the US, reconstruct detailed individual level information for 71% of the entire population, and confirm that re-identification with publicly available commercial records for 52 million individuals. So this definitely created a problem. The solution to our problem was determined to be differential privacy. So differential privacy quantifies the precise amount of privacy risk for all calculations, tables, and data products produced, no matter what external data could become available to match the data to now or at any point in the future. So inherent in this is the privacy accuracy trade-off. The only way to absolutely eliminate all risk of re-identification is to not publish any data at all, which we can't do. So we have to find an optimal balance where we provide the data that are sufficiently accurate for the intended uses while also being sufficiently noisy to meet legal and ethical obligations to protect data. And finding this balance is a policy decision. Once you identify the point on the spectrum where the data are both accurate enough and sufficiently protected, that point becomes known as the privacy loss budget, and this is referred to as the Greek letter epsilon. An epsilon of 0 is perfect privacy but useless data. An epsilon of infinity would be perfect data but no privacy at all. When comparing differential privacy with traditional disclosure avoidance techniques, neither approach is inherently better from the perspective of data accuracy. It all depends on implementations and parameters and assumptions. There are some differential privacy uses that result in highly accurate data when they're well designed and have sufficiently high privacy loss budget. And there are some implementations of traditional techniques that result in terrible data quality where they're poorly designed or have particularly high swap thresholds or self-suppression thresholds. Where differential privacy and traditional methods do substantively differ is on the privacy front. Formal privacy provides quantifiable and future-proof guarantees that traditional methods cannot. So what does this mean for the 2010 or the 2020 census? Switching to differential privacy does not change the constitutional mandate to apportion the House of Representatives according to the actual enumeration. That maintains. As in 2000 and 2010, the Census Bureau will apply privacy protections to the redistricting data, in this case, differential privacy techniques. The switch to differential privacy requires us to reevaluate the quantity of statistics and tabulations that we will release because each additional statistics and table uses up a fraction of the privacy loss budget. Our Data Stewardship and Executive Policy Committee will be making the decisions about the privacy loss budget for 2020. This includes allocations across the different data products, allocating epsilon across the different data products. There's much more information available on this topic if you want to dive in. This is a website. I think these slides are provided, or we can provide them. And there's also a mailbox where you can get at the technical experts. So if there are very technical questions, I'm going to send you to the folks that can answer those the best. But I'm happy to answer general questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Amelia.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Okay, next we will have Dr. Dendere talk. So I turn it to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Amelia, can you hear me? Okay, good. So I have the pleasure of speaking to you about data, the good, the bad, and the ugly beyond the Western borders. And I was really thoughtful in this that, you know, the terms developing country or third world are very controversial, but I will be focusing mostly on data issues in Africa. And to give a bit of background, I wanted to show you that, you know, mobile internet and social media access across the continent has increased over time. And so on this graph, you can see that, you know, 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, there was very little access to the internet. But now it's safe to say that over 90% of folks are using the internet, whether on their phones, on mobile devices, on their iPads. A lot of the use is on Facebook, as is expected, and WhatsApp, although I won't be talking about data issues regarding WhatsApp today. But it is important to just note that there is a lot of access to WhatsApp in Africa in particular. And for me, my interest in the internet and access is because there is a huge influence of social media on politics. So people mobilize using social media platforms. So we've seen a huge growth of citizen movements, whether in Nigeria, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Kenya in recent years. We've also seen that politicians spend a lot of energy campaigning online. So whether they're using WhatsApp platforms, Twitter, or Facebook, but there is a lot of politics that is happening online. We've also seen that the governments respond in a number of ways to citizens' engagement online. Something that I'm very interested on in my own work is that there's been a very harsh response by the government to internet users. So governments have tended to shut down the internet when they feel that citizen engagement is not in support of their actions. So we see that sometimes internet shutdowns are accompanied by a physical response on the ground, although in most cases it's just been completely shutting down the internet so that citizens don't have access. And so why is this important? Well, before we go there, I just wanted to show you the numbers on incidences of internet shutdown between 2016 and 2017. And the numbers have actually grown since, although we haven't tabulated the data for that. And in some cases, governments would just use threats of shutting down the internet, as happened recently in Uganda. Now, data in Africa is particularly important because we know from recent data that's been collected that citizen data is going to be the most valuable commodity over oil. Just think about that for a second, that citizen data is now one of the most valuable commodities that countries have, more than oil. In 96% of European countries, there are some data protection laws, right, that protect citizen data usage, but only 50% of African countries have actually implemented any of these regulations. So while citizen data is more sought after than natural resources, and we know that African countries and African citizens are being used as testing ground for global technologies. So whoever wants to test out an app or various technologies, there's conversation right now that the same has happened with the coronavirus. All of that is happening on the African continent, and yet there aren't many protections for Africans. And in most cases, people have no idea that their data is going to be used for anything else beyond what they have signed up for. The governments are also gaining financial advantage from selling citizen data. This year alone, we have a lot of elections, close to 20 elections just in 2020 and coming up in 2021. And in all of those elections, there is real concern that citizen data is vulnerable to some form of manipulation. We already saw that in the Kenyan elections. Cambridge Analytica played a big role in Kenyan elections and in Nigerian elections, where they were able to manipulate the information that citizens were getting, and then in some ways manipulate the outcomes for the incumbents. And this happened long before we were talking about Cambridge Analytica in the US and European elections. So even though there is a lot of data of mining of citizen data, we can see that African countries are lagging behind on consumer protection laws. And part of it might just be that, if governments are to implement full protections, then it also means that the governments won't be able to sell data and make money off of it. But it's also because the way that citizens access the internet sometimes makes it very difficult to regulate. So where do we stand? Poverty is a big threat to cybersecurity. So beyond governments, citizens themselves might be more willing. So citizens in African countries might be more willing than their counterparts in Western countries to sell their data if they're going to make some money out of it, because people are struggling and the coronavirus has made people even more vulnerable to poverty than before. So whilst Africans are not necessarily dying from the virus itself, the impact of poverty is real. And so we're seeing that citizens are more willing to part with their information if it means that they will get some kind of remuneration based on that. And then we also know that governments that are desperate for funding will continue selling citizen data, even as they implement stronger measures to curb access to the internet. So I think I spoke really fast, but I will pause there in case there are questions. Oh, and before I go, I think there are some solutions that we can take at the moment. So one of the things that people are speaking about is providing support for pro-citizen activist groups that are speaking out on data protection, support citizen education. So we know that a lot of people, not just in Africa, but globally, have no idea how their data is taken and how their data is used beyond what they've given approval for. So it's really important, I think, for governments, for NGOs to invest in citizen education. People have also been calling out for profit data companies that are more interested in making profit off of people's data at the expense of those individuals, and also supporting homegrown innovation companies. So a lot of the innovation companies that are making money from citizen data in African countries are not African, they are Western. And yet we know that we have quite a number of innovative small companies across the continent that just don't seem to have the same impact because they don't have the financial resources. And then there also needs to be a continued push for continent-wide policies, because if you have good policies, say in South Africa, that don't necessarily exist in Mozambique or exist in Zimbabwe, then those discrepancies, they have real implications for how tightly citizen data can be protected. And in my own work with Social Science 1, we've been trying to get academics access to data from Facebook so that they can, but then this is a double-edged sword, right? Because you want scientists, social scientists, to have access to citizen data so that we can study ways to protect citizens, we can study ways in which online data is used, but it also means that, technology companies are treading this very fine line between how much data do we give. And as we've seen from the first presentation, the more data you give, you are you are, removing anonymity very quickly. So that's something that in social science, when we have had to think a lot about what it means to share citizen data broadly and how much you share. And on one hand, people get frustrated because they think technology companies are not being forthright. But then on the other hand, people are also frustrated that it seems that academics are getting this unfettered access to people's personal information. So I'll pause there.
Great, thank you so much, Chipo. We're going to hold questions till the end of all the presentations, but I do want to remind folks attending today's session, if you want to ask any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, feel free to do so. And the speakers can be responding in real time, and then we'll have also an open discussion towards the end. So thank you again so much. And I want to turn it actually now over to Dr. Iyengar Plum for her talk.
Did that work? Yes. Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And I'm so thrilled to be here and to be able to talk about this. And the panel really fits so neatly together, because I think the two previous talks really highlighted some of the questions on data issues that we think about a lot in terms of transparency. But what I'd like to do is take a little bit of a step back and understand, when we say data transparency, when we want to share data, what is it we're really trying to do, and what does that mean? And this is drawn from some pretty extensive research I've done inside Google and before coming to Google at Facebook, and more broadly across the legal, social science, and HCI communities, as well as looking across different sectors like tech and healthcare and accounting and finance. And I really want to talk through three different questions. First is, what is meaningful transparency? And the key here is, I want to talk through what the components are and why that actually is relevant for generating the trade-offs that we're talking about. And the second is, what do we need to do then, given what meaningful transparency is, to balance the needs of different use cases? So if we want policymakers, but also researchers and also general users to have access to information and data, what does that actually entail? And then sort of wrap up by trying to talk through some of the inherent tensions in that process to really lay out the issues and concepts that a lot of folks are grappling with, both in tech and in government, as we move into a world of sort of bigger data that has multiple uses. So with that framing, let me start with trying to think about what are key components of how they fit together. Normally, when we think about data transparency, we jump right to the data piece, right? The technical information you see on the bottom, which is like, what is the data? Give me the code book. Like, let's look at the underlying users and run some correlations or regressions, or even link it to other data sources. But actually taking a step back, that information needs to be shared with two contexts on both sides of it. First, there needs to be some kind of clear framework to understand what you're sharing and what the purpose is. And so think about this in a bunch of different ways, right? You could think about sharing data and information in a strategy to help people understand your business. So think about operational data that different industries might share on how productive they're being. And government statistics on things like the labor force and unemployment rate. You might also want to demonstrate sort of responsibility in how you're sort of using the resources that are given to your company or industry. So think about financial reports that companies put together for their boards or publish externally. And you might want to provide understanding of the conditions in the environment, like what are we actually walking into, what are people experiencing in different settings. So think about crime statistics that are released to help understand crime rates and victimization surveys and that whole suite of information about conditions, right? Those are all very different use cases, very different conditions that imply different kinds of technical information and content around it. And sort of linking that to the technical information, there's been a lot of work trying to identify what is meaningful and accurate, accessible data and the associated information that is needed around places like tech companies, but more broadly in sort of big data situations where we want to generate both accountability and demonstrate responsibility. I'm going to talk more in detail about that technical information in just a minute, but I think the other side of this that often gets lost is the external engagement. I really loved the presentation and discussion about the census data and the split between the technical experts and the need to translate that information to audiences in a way that is understandable, accessible, and digestible. And I guess a lot of what the balance that many tech companies, and again, in other industries are trying to operate with, my dog obviously has strong feelings on these balances too, is trying to think about how to translate that to the right audiences. So what do researchers need for this transparency to be meaningful? And how is that different or overlapping with what civil society groups need, what policymakers need, and what general users need? And how can we build a program that really meets these different use cases? And so in that context, it's then helpful to start thinking about when we say technical information, a lot of times we think about, on the left side of the slide, external metrics and reports, right? Data sets, code books, data sources, summary statistics, maybe disaggregated numbers. But underlying that is a whole range of technical information that combines process maps and organizational charts that translate that data into the system so you can understand what it is you're measuring and whether that's meaningful. Direct communications to users to help them understand why certain decisions are being made or what is relevant about the numbers they're seeing and how that translates into that experience. Deep dives for researchers or audiences. Social Science One has been doing a lot of this work in trying to understand the underlying trade-offs and complexity in sharing data from companies like Facebook. And then, as I mentioned, the policies and principles that these data are capturing. So if you want to know how many violations of certain rules there are in platforms, you also need to know about the rules of the platforms. And if you want to know how many people are working in a certain sector, you need to know, how are we defining that sector? What are we counting as working, right? And all of those conditions are actually a core part of making the numbers that you ultimately release meaningful. Now, why is all of this relevant? It's the fact that you need to not just release the numbers, but this broader context and conditions, and then translate it to use cases that actually generates a number of inherent trade-offs that are things that have been grappled with across industries and between academia and government for a long, long time. So the first is trying to make sure that you have comprehensive data and metrics, statistics that are comprehensible, but still accessible, right? So you want to have as much granularity as possible, but you need it to be accessible and meaningful in substantive ways to a wide range of audiences. We already talked, and you heard from this the example of the U.S. Census, but generally you have to balance the granularity of the information you're providing with the protection of private and sensitive information. On platforms, we also, and this is often true in a number of government sort of security related data sets as well, we also need to think a little bit about how much detail to provide about the process that helps provide transparency to general users so they understand what the enforcement process is, but without revealing all of the approaches and techniques to bad actors who might want to take advantage of that information. Then, if you're really looking to make the transparency meaningful and translate it and provide different information to different folks to meet their needs, you also need to be clear why you're doing that, right? So what is the needs of researchers and why are those needs different than policymakers or general users, and how are you approaching that? The last two really relate to how these approaches can then translate into trust building. And one is there's a real trade-off here in timely access to metrics and information and data information quality. Ultimately, this is a trade-off that's faced in a number of operational settings as well as a number of industries, but there is a sort of a balance here that a number of sectors, including the tech sector, is trying to strike between these. And the last is trying to deliver ongoing consistent metrics that allow people to track things over time and do time series analysis and that, while also adapting to changing circumstances and sort of allowing innovation on approaches. And this is particularly relevant as we start thinking more about how we want to more consistently measure different types of rule violations and standard enforcement on different types of tech platforms where standardized metrics really aren't set. And there is a longer conversation to be had about what those look like and also how companies can meaningfully iterate to innovate on getting good measurement while still providing ongoing transparency about what's happening. I might just stop there in the interest of time. I'm happy to answer more questions on this, but I think that this panel really highlights the sort of end-to-end issues on that we're facing in thinking about making transparency meaningful while still safe and accurate.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll now move to our fourth and final speaker this morning, Bianca Marçu. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, great. So hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today with such an inspiring group of speakers, and thank you so much to the whole team behind BigSurv20 for making this event happen. I'm Bianca. I'm Senior Advocacy and Standards Programs Coordinator at ESOMAR and Data Protection Officer, working with ESOMAR members on all things GDPR and data protection law. ESOMAR, for those of you that don't know, is the International Association for Market, Opinion and Social Research and Data Analytics since 1947, and is based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, which is also where I'm speaking to you from today. So today I'll be talking a little bit about operationalizing ethics through an approach called data counseling. One of the topics that I'm very interested in is the concept of data ethics, but particularly on how principles of ethical data use can be operationalized within an organization. So I spend a lot of time kind of reading about ethical data use and engaging in debates around it and what this means. But when it really comes to my work, we wanted to find a way to bring these principles into practice. So one of the biggest challenges that I noticed today, which is not only relevant for the market and social research and data analytics sector, actually has two dimensions. So first, it's quite difficult to agree on ethical standards in a global context. This is for many reasons, but what might be perceived as ethical in one part of the world may not be perceived so in other parts of the world, or there are simply issues around definitions and understandings of ethics and how these differ around the world. But secondly, it's also challenging to find ways in which then those principles can come to life within an organization. So to kind of address the first part of that challenge in agreeing on specific ethical principles, the sector relies on the ICC ESOMAR Code of Conduct as the kind of foundation and starting point. So this document is undersigned by all ESOMAR members around the world and includes principles, for example, like ensuring high standards of data quality, respecting privacy, data minimization, and some other important factors that I will come back to shortly. First, just to very briefly dive into the context that I'm sure everybody in the audience is very well aware of. For some time, nearly every sector has been concerned with leveraging data, with finding new ways to utilize data to extract insights and really find patterns for a variety of different users. Most big businesses today are data businesses at heart, and we also as individuals navigating society are producing more and more data every day. At the same time, as data collection and processing technologies become more sophisticated, we will find that the data that we produce will likely become even more granular, and the sheer scale of it will be simply unimaginable. At the same time, we also see that laws regulating the collection and processing of personal data have lagged behind, particularly considering the rate of technological advancement and just the sheer number of applications that are being developed on a daily basis. So oftentimes we find that companies operate in a rather gray area when it comes to the ethical principles that can support the application of those laws when they do come into force. So this is why it's been part of our approach at ESOMAR to try and operationalize these ethical principles in a way to better help companies to better navigate this space. Another significant part of the context that we're operating in is also that the world's most ethical companies outperformed the large cap sector over 5 years by 14%. So there are many different layers to this conversation that we kind of take into account. On the one hand, there is a business's legitimate use of data for business purposes. And on the other hand, companies have a responsibility to ensure that that processing doesn't lead to harm to individuals and society. So with this in mind, the key principles that we've identified as being relevant here and as a first step are fairness, respect, transparency, and accountability. And here what we've done in an effort to bring, to begin to operationalize these principles is to identify those very tangible aspects of data processing to which they relate. So first we have fairness, which stems from the fact that data is not neutral, particularly different categories of personal data and going into sensitive personal data. And we also know that processing data can have the capacity for both good and bad. It can be put towards a use that has a beneficial impact on society and people, or it can lead to the opposite, where it can exclude people or hinder societies. So one way to try to ensure some fairness is data minimization and data quality. With data minimization, you're collecting only that data that is necessary to achieve a particular purpose. And by ensuring the highest levels of data quality, we can hopefully limit errors and limit risks. Secondly, respect. It's all about respect for the people behind the data. And this is something that's very much linked to data protection laws, such as the EU GDPR and many others around the world. Respect also relates to very much the principle of fairness, because by adhering to the concept of data minimization, you're also hopefully staying away from particularly intrusive data practices that might require excessive amounts of data collection. Thirdly, transparency relates to making clear the scope of the processing insofar as that's possible. This principle is perhaps really the most widely known as accepted, but also the most difficult to implement, as Dr. Ingrid Plum highlighted in her presentation. And this is so particularly for organizations whose data processing is highly complex and convoluted. So how do we explain this in everyday terms? Or how might we be able to explain an outcome or a decision that was arrived at through automated means? And finally, accountability. And this comes down to something that's very practical, and in part it's about record keeping and documentation and developing adequate policies and procedures around data processing. And here also relates to the kind of dissemination of those policies and procedures within the organization, and particularly to employees that deal directly with data on a daily basis. So with this in mind, we can turn our attention to the kind of the data counseling approach. So this brings together everything that we've just covered in a balanced way. On the one hand, acknowledging and leveraging the power and usefulness of data, and on the other hand, minimizing harm through agreed upon principles. So the principles that we just identified form the foundation of the data ethics component of an organization's overall data strategy, and what we've been focusing on today. It's also important to note that it's generally not sufficient for a couple of people or small group of people within an organization to develop completely the data strategy in isolation, but it's also really important to raise awareness of it and train all employees in this. So let's take a look at the component parts of what make up the part of the data strategy that concerns itself with data ethics. And you can see that at the very center are the 4 key principles that we identified. And then first, we also then start by asking the right questions. So what kind of data are we working with, and what data is necessary to achieve a specific purpose, for example? Does this data reveal possibly sensitive details about individuals, or can we ensure the highest standards of data quality? So these types of questions are a really good starting point. And it might also mean that it will lead likely to many other questions that require attention, particularly if you're doing this for the first time. This exercise also leads nicely into the ethics risk assessment. So if we can't ensure the highest standards of data quality, for example, what could be the risks based on what we know this data set will be used for? Or can we, for instance, ensure transparency around data processing, which shows respect for people behind the data? Or another really good question, what might be the risk should a data breach occur? And then on the basis of these questions, you can move on to mitigating factors. So if, for example, we understand the risks of a potential data breach, in particular relation to a data processing activity, what can we do to limit those risks as much as possible? And finally, routine. So this is all about getting into the habit of going through these steps on a regular basis, either at various time intervals or whenever there's a new project or processing activity underway. And finally, just some kind of points to end on. Some of you may have noticed that many of the terms I used in the presentation are really taking inspiration from data protection and privacy laws that you'll be familiar with. The concept of an ethics risk assessment, for example, comes from the mandatory data protection impact assessment from the EU GDPR, which is something that works. So as a tool, it can also be tweaked and applied in different scenarios as well. Secondly, it's also really important to develop an ethical data strategy organization-wide. And this is where training and awareness raising really allow those strategies to materialize and to be executed in the day-to-day. And finally, doing this kind of really brings home the importance of routine. So just like organizations are mostly now in the habit of reviewing privacy policies every year, mitigating ethical risks also needs to become part of that routine. So thank you so much for your attention. And Amelia, I pass the floor back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Bianca. And thank you to all the speakers. That was a great set of presentations. We've actually had a couple of questions come up in the Q&A and a few through chat. I have a question for each of you. So I'm going to use my role as moderator to ask my questions first, and then we will go through the Q&As and also have some open discussion. So my first question is actually for you, Jennifer. My question is this: I know that US Census has put a lot of thought into and work into picking the right balance between noise and data accuracy. But census data is often, of course, used to make a lot of really important policy and social decisions. So I wanted to get your perspective on how do you guarantee that the right decisions are being made if there's some uncertainty in the data?
Sure, thanks, Amelia. This is a great question because obviously there's no perfect point between privacy and accuracy, because to maintain perfect privacy, you sacrifice accuracy and vice versa. So the Census Bureau over the last few years has been working with data users. The Census Bureau put out a demonstration data product using differential privacy a little bit ago and worked with data users to try to work towards that optimal point where the data users are getting the products that they need at the level that they need them, while we're maintaining the mathematically provable privacy protections that formal privacy models allow us to have. So I think what we're doing to address that, we can't guarantee that we'll get to the right place, but we're working with the data users and trying to, looking at the laws that say how census data will be used, making sure we're meeting the law, the legal requirements, and then working with other data users as well. So gathering as much information as we can until our Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee actually sets the point, which will happen at some point in the, I guess, near future at this point.
Great, thank you so much. My next question is for you, Dr. Dendere, and that is, development and humanitarian actors have had for a long time a mandate to provide assistance and protect people in some of the world's most challenging political, social, and economic environments. With the advent of technology and the fast-paced environment in which we now live, is there a place for assistance and protection in technological environments in that mandate? So is that mandate shifting with the advance of technology? And what is needed to advance this aspect of humanitarian assistance?
Thank you. Well, I think that it's not shifting so that the protections are behind and non-governmental organizations are behind. And I think it's because the digital space is moving so quickly. And for a while, we had no idea just how much of an impact all of these would have on individual lives. And I think the information on the selling of data is only coming out now. I think there've just been a handful of books, including Nanjala's book on digital access in the Kenyan elections. I think it's one of the very few books that have exposed the breadth of the challenge that we're facing, especially in rural and poor communities. So I think a number of things would need to be done. I think investing in citizen education. So really getting people to understand that each time you say yes to some pop-up on Facebook, to some link that you're sent via WhatsApp, you are consenting to selling your data. And this is something that people are not very knowledgeable about, because somebody wants to watch a video, so it comes with some pop-up that's asking for their data, and people just, we would just say yes, because what could be the harm? But there is some real harm that's being done. And then second of all, it's exposing the kind of danger that exists, right? So for most people, it's, well, why does it matter that some Russian company has my information? What could they possibly do with it? Well, now we know that, people's information can be used to make passports in their names that they're not aware of. We know that their information can be used in trials that they, in experiments that they haven't consented to. So I think we have a lot of work to do in really getting people to understand what it means when your data is out there with or without your consent. And then obviously, supporting the activists that are already on the ground that are pushing back on the selling of citizen data in particular. So there is a lot of work to be done. And I think the honest answer is that there isn't much that's being done at all. And again, I think it's because it's such a new field and a new threat to the global community as a whole.
Great. Yeah, lots more work to be done, I think. My next question is for Dr. Iyengar Plum. So Google, of course, has faced some serious trust issues when it comes to its users. Do you think what you're doing now is helping to rebuild that trust? Is it working? And a related note, does it even matter at this point? Google has such a lion's share of the marketplace that some users going away may not make a difference. So is it really bothering Google? Do they care that much?
So it's interesting, you sort of frame this around the does Google care? Do we need it as a market share? But I think a different framing on this is why do we care about user trust? What does user trust actually matter? And I think there are a couple of different roles of that. One is, Google as a provider and a sort of responsible company wants to ensure that what they're doing is sort of meaningfully translated to its users as part of its general responsibility of being in this ecosystem. And I think there's a piece there that gets undervalued, and that is sort of common across a lot of the tech sector in trying to think about how that approach to responsibility and accountability matters. And in that vein, sort of Google has published some white papers on this, on how we do content moderation and think about information quality, but so lots of other companies, right? Facebook has some, Twitter has some, you see this across the industry because I think it matters. But the second is, I think of sort of the online community as really a partnership between the platforms that are providing services and users that are using it. And it's true that without users, Google wouldn't exist, and Google provides an essential service to them. And so we need to sort of together try to hand in glove figure out how to make this sort of safe and effective and meet user needs, many of which vary a lot around the globe. So that's a lot of sort of verbiage to say, I think that where we're at now is trying to figure out what the right trade space is. And sort of you heard that from Dr. Child, from the census and Jennifer Childs on the census side. We don't have the perfect answer between privacy and accuracy. We don't have the perfect answer between safety and security trade-offs and privacy trade-offs. We don't have the perfect answers between these gulfs. And I think user trust is a critical input into helping us get to those answers. How much should we be disclosing? How much risk are we willing to take on in communities for there to be greater data transparency? How much risk are we willing to have companies bear so that we don't have to worry about adversarial actors, right? How much, and all of that relies on us building this partnership of trust with our users and with our the research community. And that's, I think, where as a company, many of the tech companies are, and I hope where we can kind of get to with many users.
Great, thank you so much. And my final question is for you, Bianca. And my question is this. In theory, the idea of standard language and data counseling seems smart and like a no-brainer, but I can see some private industries not wanting to adjust or change or have counseling because it disrupts their business. Either it makes their business harder or more expensive. And I know you talked about how ethical principles, actually there's data to suggest that business operations are improved by applying these. But for folks who may sort of question or push back on sort of the kinds of work that Isomart and you do, I'm wondering how you reconcile those perspectives. What are the messaging or messages that are persuasive to folks, or maybe the ones that you find will be most compelling to people who may have questions about this?
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing I would say is that, these types of changes, which are essentially both industry-wide and also cross-organizational changes, do take time and have taken a lot of time. It's also taken a lot of time to arrive at this stage where there are so many kind of conferences and events focusing on these types of really important issues. I like to use the example of the GDPR and laws such as California Consumer Privacy Act, just because they really put data protection and privacy issues on the map again and brought these topics really into the mainstream. Again, this didn't happen overnight, but one of the things that it led to is kind of the public also demanding more from companies via social media, with tweets or posts that can, they can expose bad privacy practices or bad ethical practices. And these go viral and have become something that can't really be ignored. This again took a long time, but it is happening, and I think companies are taking note. And I think on the other hand, there is indeed that kind of business advantage. So I think the public have an important role to play here in terms of kind of pushing companies to think about how they're using data. And I think specifically on the concept of data counseling is that it also calls for balance. So it acknowledges that businesses have a legitimate interest in leveraging data and in creating strategies for data monetization, but this practice shouldn't be designed in a way that can lead to harm or that can cause harm. And I think this is where there is no one answer just yet, but I think it's where real meaningful innovation lies, and it's really an opportunity for companies to innovate in the space and find that balance. So it's really interesting. It'd be great to hear more about techniques around differential privacy, as Jennifer elaborated on, or different methods of encryption. So these are practices that really deserve much more attention on an international plane as well.
Great, thanks so much, Bianca. I am now going to actually go through some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A and in the chat feature. In the meantime, I want to remind everyone, you can drop more questions into the Q&A. You can also, and Shane, you can correct me if I'm wrong, people can raise their hand and we can unmute you to ask a question live to the panel. So the first question that's come up is from Peter Luptig, and it is this. I have a question for all the panelists, so all of the speakers can answer. When collecting data in an international context, such as Google or multinational market research, how do you deal with the fact that rules differ over countries? In practice, do you see that standard setting, like the GDPR, becomes the default, leading to converge in rules and standards over time, or is there also a case for future divergence?
Do you want us to just jump in?
Yeah.
Great. Why don't I start? So I think there are two issues here that you're noting. Like in practice, things like GDPR are things that like companies like Google or Facebook or Twitter need to comply with, and we do. I think there is an effort now, and I'm actually really interested. I think this is a great place for academics and tech company researchers to partner, is on what should a reasonable global standard be? Because in some senses, the data is global, it is not local. And there are local rules that generate compliance, and the sort of patchwork of different local compliance rules can sometimes make it really difficult to have meaningful data analysis and data access across space and geography in ways that don't make sense in the digital context. So I think the short answer is, in practice, yes, we start kind of taking the more stringent regulations or specific regulations for large markets and kind of create a more standardized approach. But that's really a pragmatic response, and maybe there's a better response that can be done in partnership and in discussion with sort of key experts on what right looks like here, and sort of rather than just responding as they come in.
Great, thank you so much, Radha. Bianca or Chipo or Jennifer, any other thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think really just kind of echoing what Radha mentioned. I think so far it has been quite frustrating for a lot of the companies that at least I've been working with, to kind of, and particularly international companies or ones that operate internationally, to be able to design a kind of compliance framework or a framework of standards that really works throughout their operations, just because of the, as Radha mentioned, the patchwork of different rules that are coming out across the world. And I think on average, I think the GDPR has kind of become a bit of a default setting when it comes to data protection, compliance, and privacy. But we don't know where it's going to go from here. I mean, I think we see data protection laws popping up all around the world. You know, there's a kind of new one every week, or there are countries that are updating their privacy laws, either to be more in line with the GDPR or go a little bit beyond. And so, yeah, I think it really remains to be seen where it's going to go from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Bianca. I just wanted to give,
Yeah.
you've come off of mute, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to look through my notes, and I love what Radha said, but I also think that what we've seen in Europe is a really good example. So European countries have been more successful, I think, than anywhere else in putting restrictions. And we've seen this from the social science one perspective, that it's been very, very difficult to get access to European citizen data for Facebook, for researchers and scholars. And while that's, you know, so for me, I think about it on two parts. As a citizen, I think it's great. As a scholar, I find it very frustrating because, you know, nobody has access to data, which means we can't do the work that we want to do. But I think it's better for countries to have stringent rules to begin with that we can then negotiate with. Whereas in other places, particularly in African countries, again, where I think, you know, people's data is just being harvested without any knowledge, it's way too easy for people to just gain access. And since Radha is here, I would actually pose and say that I think Google is also one of those companies that has had unthreatened access to data in African countries. And I haven't seen any kind of pushback. And I think it's because people really do depend on Google. You hear often, you know, in conversation with people, it's especially right now with the COVID crisis, which means that, you know, a lot of children have been out of school. People have become so dependent on Google for everything. And because of that, a lot of their information is just out there, free for. And I would really want to know what sort of steps Google has taken on their part to protect vulnerable communities, especially during the pandemic, where more and more people are dependent on Google for good reason, right? It's great access to information. You don't need very much money. It's equalizing in some sense. But I think it would be very interesting to know what the company, what steps the company has taken to protect vulnerable communities.
Sorry, did you want me to answer directly?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to make you the spokesperson for Google, but I was, yeah, if you can, absolutely. But I was just.
So I guess like this is, if I'm perfectly candid, I'm sure I don't know everything Google does in this space, and there is, a tremendous amount and a number of teams across Google that work in this space. The thing I will note is, Google in some senses served as an industry leader, and 10 years ago launching government request transparency reports and a range of transparency reports to provide at least information on what content they are removing, what government requests are coming to them for content to be removed, and then a range of other transparency reports on security and privacy, including a safe browsing report and encryption reports that are all sort of publicly available. So I think as a starting point, there is some data transparency there, but I think the point is well taken for Google and other folks, which is I think the pandemic has shown how important and dependent we are on our online communities. And we probably do need a set of norms and greater transparencies on the policies and processes translated in meaningful ways to the communities that are impacted by it in order to really assure them that the products and services they rely on are responsible actors in this space. And I think there's definitely more work to be done on translating what the companies are doing to the users who are impacted by those decisions.
Thank you.
Great. So there's actually a follow-up question to this one, which is, even within the same context, such as the GDPR, countries differ in both what is legally needed and what is ethically accepted. This leads in multi-country studies to either the situation that the strongest constraints dominate or that comparability is lost as countries start to differ in what data they use and or how they address data holders' respondents. How do we deal with these differences? Again, for all panelists.
Maybe I can go. I think maybe I addressed it a little bit before, but I think the kind of standard approach that I've seen, at least in the kind of market research and data analytics sector, has been to adopt GDPR as the kind of the gold standard in a way when it comes to data collection and data processing. And I think also because of the fact that this sort of media storm that came with the GDPR and the huge amount of attention that it got around the world, and the fact that many of its principles have been replicated in other data protection laws around the world, also that actually responders or data holders may even expect such a level of compliance from an international company in particular. And I know also from a kind of compliance perspective and operational perspective, it may just be easier to implement that gold standard across the operations rather than also then, create that patchwork internally for yourself as well.
Great. So a quick question for you, Bianca, from Kevin Boza. Can your ethical framework be shared or is it accessible somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share that with you. I'm not sure if it's up on the website. I'm sure it is somewhere, but I can get that to you, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, so for folks on the line, we can certainly follow up with a link to that post this session. And then another question that's come in the Q&A, again from Peter. So this is, this question is, a lot of the new kind of cool data, digital data that we have seen at BigSurv20 is private data in the sense that it may have been collected by companies like Twitter, Facebook, etc. Governments and academics have trouble collecting similar data and using these for social good. There have been initiatives like Social Science One with the idea of bridging this accessibility issue. How do you see the future of such initiatives? certainly Chipo, you might have some thoughts there, but I welcome thoughts from others in terms of other initiatives outside of Social Science 1 that folks are aware of.
I mean,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. First, I should apologize if you can hear baby screaming. It seems that my 6-month-old daughter is back. I don't know why, but she's back and she's speaking loudly. So Social Science 1, we've actually hit some roadblocks, quite some significant ones. As I mentioned earlier, in Europe, the compliance laws in Europe have made it a bit of a challenge to gain data access for Europe. For Africa, though, it's been fairly easy to do that. But we are moving beyond. So there are some talks to move beyond Social Science 1 and think about ways to empower social science centers within the continent. And then building up from there to think about, well, what is the kind of data that is good for academics to have access to? And what kind of negotiating can we do with tech companies, be it Google, Facebook, and Twitter, so that we are not just getting data that they have restricted and that they think we should have, but we're actually getting access to data that is useful. But then, after this, I keep thinking back to what Jennifer has said, is that the more data we release, the more likely we are making people's identity easy to identify. So now I'm going to have to go back to my partners at Social Science 1 so that we can think more critically about this, because as a researcher, all we want is data, and more data. But now, obviously, I'm thinking, so I think this is a weird time for me to be answering this question, because before Jennifer had spoken, I would have told you that our push is to get as much data as we can. But then now I'm also thinking, we have so much to reconsider, and whether we need all kinds of data or, I don't know. I have to now just go back and think more carefully about what it is that we want, and then what it is that we need, that researchers actually need to be able to do good work.
I think this is a really interesting question too. Lately, we've been talking at the Census Bureau about uses for thinking about like mobility and cell phone location data and using, but there's danger in that, right? Having a massive amount of cell phone location data that's identifiable to people and households. So we've been talking through how we might work with a partner. I hadn't thought about something like the Social Science 1 model, but how we might work with a partner so that the Census Bureau is not ingesting this enormous amount of data, so that we're not putting ourselves at risk. But rather, is there aggregate information that we could ingest and then be able to answer our research questions? So it's a really interesting question, and I don't have any answer, just to say that we've been thinking about this.
Maybe I can add something there as well from kind of the European perspective, let's say. I know that recently data altruism will be introduced more seriously in Europe through the Data Governance Act. This just became public really a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago. And this will outline rules for reusing public sector data. And it will also allow companies and individuals to essentially donate that data and pool that data for the public good and for altruistic purposes. So far, the reaction has been quite positive. And I know the European Commission is also set to release next week a Data Services Act and a Data Markets Act. So kind of on the one hand, it also makes me think that maybe the GDPR was just the beginning. But in terms of how this kind of data pooling and reuse of data might go in the future depends on how something like data altruism will really be implemented in practice, because it needs to be a system that's made easy and accessible for everybody involved, which depends on the funding, on the infrastructure, on the implementation. So it's definitely something to watch and see how it progresses.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question for you, Radha. It's, and others can weigh in, but it's in particular for based on your experience at Google. So the question is this: how has your work affected consent or user agreement language you currently use at Google?
So I should caveat this by saying I've only been at Google for 9 months and started there in the middle of the pandemic. So I would say my specific work has probably not impacted it a ton for a variety of reasons related to timing and external conditions. But like taking a step back, the question, I think, user consent agreements and language is like a super complicated space. And there's the legal side of it, and there's the user communication side of it. And at Google, and where I was previously at Facebook, and I think across the tech companies, there's an increased focus on how we can more meaningfully translate rules and terms to users in ways they can understand. So that is not just the long, like, blah, blah, blah that like you get when you initially sign on or set up an account, but actually user-focused communication so that you can really own your internet hygiene, your privacy and data use, but also be aware of places where they may be risks, communications of potentially unverified or risky content. And I think that space of improving user communications is heavily research driven and is heavily sort of like survey driven, both in how to prioritize where the communications are, and then actually testing what are meaningful and effective ways to translate those more legalistic and complex rules to users in their everyday use of these products.
Great. Chipo, Jennifer, Bianca, anything you want to add to that? Thanks, Radha. Okay, so we have another question that's come in from Carolina Matson. And that question is this: the mobility question helped me formulate something in between the fully granular data on X mobility and aggregated data that can be used for outward facing research. There is the research work required to create good aggregate data from fully granular data. These kinds of research questions often fall between both legal and routine frameworks. How can this be done better and more deliberate? How can this be better and more deliberately supported? Carolina, if you want to come off mute and clarify if anything in that question, feel free to do so.
So I actually have been spending a lot of time thinking about this. So let me start in that. I think there's like the sexy part of research, which is like getting your data and answering really interesting questions and trying to like influence policies or activities or business operations. And there's the like unsexy, but I think critically important part of how we set up our backend data architecture and infrastructure in a way that makes it both like accurate and free flowing, but also protected and secure. And so like, for instance, I have been doing a lot of thinking on if we have these large data sources and you want to create aggregate top line numbers and then something in between that is accessible, what does that look like? Do we need a data vault structure where your like data is piped in and structured in it? Do we need some kind of verifiability or accountability? What does access look like, and how can you make that access sort of meaningful for people when they're global, right? So if you can't have everyone come into an office or a clean room to use the data, what does access look like, and how do you make it secure while still granular enough to do analysis? And where do you sort of draw the lines on where the hard wall of a vault is versus the sort of more malleable internal content that you might switch around at different degrees of aggregation. And I think those questions on data structure and data architecture are often not discussed in these sort of like policy and ethics and regulation conversations because they feel sort of ancillary, but actually are the critical way in which we implement meaningful access and control of people's data. And so I think the question is a fair one. I don't think we have an answer to it. I think like the census has had a longer run model on having sort of layered levels of access in which people can access certain levels of information purely publicly. Then there's some additional layers at certain centers and then additional layers through deputization process. And that's certainly like one model to look at, but we are exploring these models. And I think it's a really important question to highlight just how critical this is to meaningful data access.
So just to give a plug in for Social Science One, I think this is something we are doing not extremely well, because I don't think anyone gets, an A on this, but because we are concerned about various issues, and I'm just going to read from our website to make sure that I say this very accurately. But what we've done with the data from Facebook is that before it's released to individuals, of course, people must apply and give us their proposal and tell us exactly what they plan to use the data for. But before we then grant the data, a panel of experts actually goes through the data that's been made available by Facebook, and then it's cleared by the commission and other external experts that we have. And then there's a lot of negotiation between the Facebook's privacy laws and what the research teams would like to have. And so the data itself goes through multiple stages of not auditing as such, but review to make sure that we're not releasing any information that's not needed. And I think this is one place where, when getting a lot of data, it's actually good, because at that point, the data points are so large that it would take a lot of work for somebody to break it down to particular individuals. So I think that's where, Social Science One, if we were to work with other big data companies like Google or Twitter, the expertise that is available through Social Science One has been able to do some really good work in making data widely available. Well, not widely available, because, we can only give it to so many people who apply, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, just generally, I think we do a good job of making sure that the data is clean enough and protected enough.
I can jump in just from this one particular mobility use case. So the way that we're approaching this one particular thing is to figure out what our research questions are and what's the least detailed amount of data, or what's the least amount of data that we could acquire, and to be able to answer our research questions, and then having the conversation with our policy and legal staff about privacy risks associated with obtaining this data. So I think for just a particular use case, starting with the research questions and figuring out, it is, as Radha was saying, it's fun to dive into data and see what you can find. But if you're kind of starting the other way to say, if I just want to answer this one question, what's the amount of data that I would need for that?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we've gone through all the questions in the chat. I want to pause here and just allow folks to raise their hands, come off mute if there are any questions folks want to ask in real time. Shane, just checking in with you. Is anyone raising their hand that I am missing?
Oh, thanks, Amelia. I do not see anyone with their hand raised. So maybe give them a few more seconds and we'll see.
Okay. Okay. Well, I have a couple more questions that I wanted to end the session with, or sort of as we wind down the session. My first question is actually back to you, Jennifer, and I was curious your thoughts, or if the Census Bureau is giving any sort of thinking to younger generations and changing perceptions of privacy and participation in the census, and where that kind of falls, if anywhere, with regards to the work that you're doing around, balancing noise with privacy.
Sure. So that's actually the area that I've been working on public opinion towards the privacy accuracy trade-off. And in our most recent study, actually the last two studies, we found that the 18 to 24 age group expressed more concern over loss of privacy of their census data, which is not necessarily something that we had expected a priori, but I think it shows that ideas about privacy and privacy protection are highly contextual. So whereas privacy might not be valued in one place or might be valued differently in one place, people often view, I don't know, government data collection different than they would data collected by a third party that they might use for they might get other uses from. So I guess I'm not sure how to answer. I think the younger folks we're seeing have privacy concerns that are maybe even greater than the older generations at this point in time with regard to government data. So I think it's just keeping an eye on that is what we're going to do.
Great, thanks. I also wanted to ask a question to Bianca and Chipo combined. And I was curious about this idea of data counseling and how that works in the Global South context. And can it work? Is it something that, Bianca, that you've had experience with? I'm just curious in terms of cross-cultural situations where the idea of data counseling might be perceived differently.
Yeah, I think it's more challenging to implement a concept like data counseling when specific data protection and privacy laws or laws that regulate the use of data are not already in place as a kind of foundation or a kind of starting point. There are many countries around the world that since the GDPR have implemented similar data protection and privacy laws with principles around good practice. And that makes it, having that foundation is really, really important in terms of building on and looking at how a data strategy might actually be structured. So it will take some time until the same level of impact is reached. Just kind of related to that, there's also a perception that ethical data use and innovation or business success, they can't really coexist. And there is really yet another issue of resources. So for some larger companies or international companies, it might be a lot easier to hire, lawyers or consultants to figure out kind of compliance issues or to regulate or to design ethical strategies. But small and medium-sized businesses, for them, that's not really the case. So a balance is needed there and a kind of democratization of resources as well.
Yeah, I like this concept of democratizing access to resources. And I also think more than anything else, it's citizen education so that people can be empowered to decide whom to give their data and how their data is given. And I also think even for smaller companies, there are very small steps that people can take, right? So letting people know on your website what data is going to be used and what that data might be used for. And I think Facebook started doing this with some third-party apps that you could access through Facebook, where initially, people's data was just being harvested by these third-party apps. But now I think when people download or say yes to those apps, there's a pop-up window that comes and, gives users the information that if you say yes to this app, they have access to your name, your date of birth, your email, whatever identifying information. Is this something that you want to do? Of course, not everybody reads those, so it's really hard to mandate. So I think investing in citizen education is critical, but also pushing back on countries, because I think in Africa, a big challenge is that data has become an income generating resource for governments. And so pushing back on governments for that, or some kind of citizen government agreement on what data gets sold and and who benefits from that. So I think there are multiple layers of conversations that need to be held.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to close the session with 2 questions to each of the panelists. Before I do that, I want to just highlight that Kristen Olson actually put in the Q&A box that there is a call for papers on privacy, confidentiality, and disclosure protection. It's a special issue. Submissions are due by January 31st, 2021, and the link to the information is there in the Q&A box. And that is for the Journal of Survey Statistics and Methodology. So I actually believe I shared that with the speakers yesterday or the day before, but for folks on the line who might be interested in that, the information is in the Q&A box with the link to the full details. So to close us out, in the spirit of and with the focus on data and privacy, I would like each of our panelists to answer 2 questions. And those are, what would you walk across hot coals for? And what keeps you up at night? And so we'll start with, we'll go in reverse order, and we'll start with Bianca.
Okay, I think going first, what would I walk across hot coals for? I think I mentioned it briefly before, but I think the democratization of, I guess, technology and in a way, access to resources. I think that really a diversity of voices and people from different backgrounds need to be included in the development of technology, as well as in the decision-making process on how those technologies will be deployed and in which contexts. There's a lot of research, brilliant research that is happening in the space and on more granular issues like algorithmic bias, for example, and diversity really needs to be included in these conversations, especially. So I think that's the first thing, what keeps me up at night. I think this is probably more with kind of my lawyer hat on, but it would be really great to arrive at at harmonized rules on privacy, on data protection, on ethical data use internationally, because we know that data doesn't stop at borders, it's always in transit, and this harmonization is something that will really benefit the entire ecosystem. It would be beneficial not only for individuals in terms of knowing more what to expect when the data travels or when they might use a particular service from a company that is located in a different country to where they're located from. So that aspect of kind of education and awareness raising, but it will also benefit, small and medium-sized businesses that, again, don't have the resources to hire multiple lawyers or experts to kind of help them navigate an international landscape and be compliant in that way.
Great. And Radha?
Well, what keeps me up at night, really the true answer is my children, who are my youngest, who is teething and very noisy. But I think framed out, taking a step back a little bit, I think making sure that we're designing the online space that they're going to inhabit in a way that I want them to inhabit it, right? I don't want it to be no safety and all privacy and localized data. I don't want to shut down access and information flows, but I also don't want them to step into a sort of wild west of the online presence where there are no controls and no transparency. And so I think for me, what keeps me up at night is what are the things we need to do now so that in 10 years, when they're online all the time, which I'm sure they will be, I can feel good about that. And what would I walk across hot coals for? It's worth saying that I started my sort of tech journey working on user safety issues, really focused on child grooming and non-consensual intimate images. And I think that has imbued in me this view on this trade-off that we often take it from a privacy and research and data use. And I would walk across coals to re-envision our data landscape with a victim-centered view instead of sort of purely sort of average user view. And I think there are a lot of at-risk users who just don't have the protections and confidence and information they need to safely navigate. And I think we all, research, tech, government, could do better there.
Great. Chipo?
I think for me, the coronavirus, the pandemic has made certain things clear. And one of the things that have been on my mind is how do we get education access to millions of poor children, particularly on the African continent. But how do we do that whilst protecting their innocence that often gets so lost when kids are online without supervision? And how do we get more of these platforms that allow kids access to educational material, but without necessarily being on the, on the web? And what would I work over hot coals for? As a new mom, I would have wanted to be able to share pictures of my kid on Facebook, but I don't. And I don't because I do this kind of work, right? So I put up posts that don't have a name because I've had conversations, when working with tech companies where people have seen a picture of their child taken and used by somebody else, and they've tried to push back. And the question is always, how do you prove that this is your child? And it's like, I'm telling you it's my child because it's my child. But I think about it more than my own kid, and rather say that, in 10 years when our kids are online, how is this a safe space for them? How do we make sure that they're going to enter the space as consenting adult, individuals, not adults, but as consenting individuals who know that their information is not going to be abused. But, and yes, I think that our kids in Western countries are more protected, particularly kids in Europe. And then I keep going back to, how do we protect the African kid where some celebrity goes and takes a bunch of pictures of them in their most vulnerable circumstance and then put those pictures on Twitter, on Facebook, and that kid has no recourse to get their pictures pulled off, And so this is why I get so upset when celebrities go to Africa and take a bunch of pictures of kids just so vulnerable. And I'm thinking, when this kid is 21, they don't want that picture of themselves with no underwear online, but there is no recourse for individuals to say to Facebook, that's me, pull me down. It's a lot harder than people think it is. And I don't think there's a way for people to contact Google and say, look, this picture of me that's trending, that's popping up on Google when you put whatever words in, that's me. And I don't want that picture there. And so I think there's just not enough people that are thinking of, rather say sort of victim-centered policies. And we just don't have enough uniformity across the globe to protect particularly the more vulnerable, the children, the poor, the disabled, who might not always be able to speak up for themselves in these platforms.
Great. And finally, Jenny.
Sure. So I think my answer goes back to public trust, that the Census Bureau can maintain public trust and display integrity and transparency in all of our decision making. That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We're a few minutes over 11:30, and I know we're all going to be getting ready for the closing session today. But thanks to my 4 wonderful panelists. Wonderful job today. Really interesting conversation. Thanks for everyone who attended. And again, to the organizing committee for BigSurv20. Thank you. And the slides will be posted on the web as well as the recording. And we will figure out a way to get Bianca's framework out to attendees after the session. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.